Hey, how's it going? Dave the Klone here, checking in for another 15 minutes of movie memories with all of my folks here at the Hollow 9 Network. Thank you for stopping by. I hope you got a cup of coffee or we're hanging out near the water cooler, whatever it so happens to be in your case. And it's an interesting time, you know. One of the hardest things with this podcast is deciding which movie to talk about every time I sit down at the mic. I have so many I could that they all start to kind of like run together. So I figured why not add some organization to the chaos and go with something that's celebrating an anniversary. And, you know, it's currently September of 2023, and there are a ton of movies that turned 30 this month, including one True Romance starring Christian Slater and Patricia Arquette, and a whole bevy of other Hollywood heavy hitters at the time. I mean, I'm talking about Gary Oldman as a Jamaican just coming off of Dracula drug dealer, so he's got a little bit of the Transylvania still going on in this movie, which is one of the things that sticks with me so vividly, is how that performance, you know, it's almost hard to say, you know, obviously Christian Slater's the star of this movie, also the first script that Quentin Tarantino ever actually sold, and it was directed by the late, great Tony Scott of Top Gun fame, and so many other movies too. So you can see it was sort of like one of the things I've been finding as I try to kind of get my memory banks going for this show is that the 90s was definitely a lost time of renaissance as far as looking back goes. So, you know, from a hindsight 2020 type of perspective, it was a time where magic like this would happen, where you get this amazing director who has some like huge tentpole, you know, industry founding pillars of the industry, credits under their belt, taking on subject matter or an intellectual property from sort of a new player in town. And I mean, by this point we hadn't seen Pulp Fiction yet, right? So we didn't know that much about who Quentin Tarantino was. If you lived in Hollywood, if you went to the video store he worked at, if you were in his circle of friends, of course you knew who he was and you knew he was going to be somebody huge. But the rest of us out in movie land, we hadn't been seeing a lot of stuff like this. The movie also, one of the big things that stands out to me when I remember the time when this movie was new, was the fact that they build all these people in the trailer. So you had Gary Oldman, you had Michael Rappaport, you had what's his name? Why is it all of a sudden Brad Pitt? Like, oh my God, I'm forgetting Brad Pitt's name. And this is after almost 300 days of sobriety. So go. I don't know. Go figure what that means. Dennis Hopper and Christopher Walken. Holy crap! I mean, let's put a pin in that one because we got to talk about their scene. Who did I not mention yet? Chris Penn, the late great Chris Penn, and the late great Tom Sizemore. Bronson Pinchot. Come on, Balky Bartokomous in a movie where he's not playing Surge from Beverly Hills Cop. And I'm sure I'm forgetting a few that will hopefully come to mind as we go through. Oh my God, early days James Gandolfini, which maybe even at that time, he probably didn't get billed at that time in the trailer, but definitely when you watch it now and you go, holy shit, Tony Soprano. And this is also one of the first movies that was like kind of really well known to have a completely different version of itself floating around. There's the theatrical, and then there's the sort of director's cut, which was so much cooler. My God, the director's cut of this movie, it goes, to me, it's like, you know, there are a few movies that the director's cut, okay, they added like 5 seconds of extra shit and it really didn't make that much of an impact, but then there are some that stand out, like Aliens and Alien, for that matter, that where there's like entire scenes and entire like sort of plot twists that were cut out. And in this one, the sort of difference of the way the movie ends and some of the ultra violence, because this was, you know, in a weird time, in a time where you could experiment with kinds of crazy violence. You know, last time we talked about Heat with the sort of broad daylight armored car robbery, and just go figure, nobody's done that since. You know, it's amazing how that kind of stuff that takes that kind of effort and planning doesn't ever translate into, oh, we're afraid people might do this. But nowadays, we are such a strange group as a society that you really never know what's going to set off that powder keg of, holy crap, are people going to go do this? Are people going to forget the difference between make-believe and reality? But definitely some really ultra-violent scenes with Patricia Arquette towards the end of the movie that were toned down, I think, for the theatrical release, but in the director's cut are, back in full blazing glory of, insanity. And but as we don't want to get too far away from the sort of folks being billed in the trailer, because I felt like this was one of the first times that I was very, I don't know, I don't want to say confused, but kind of miffed a little bit, I guess, in some ways, because you also had Val Kilmer very prominently featured in the trailer, dressed like Elvis, and what you didn't know or wouldn't know until you went to actually go see the movie is that he is actually appearing as sort of the ghost of Elvis, that the main character, played by Christian Slater, Clarence Horley, would be talking to whenever he's by himself in the bathroom, whenever he's looking in the mirror, kind of pumping himself up for whatever he's got to do. He's sort of meeting with his consigliere, he's consulting with this ghost of Elvis, and he's always in soft focus and in the background and very far away. He's never in full focus. You don't actually see him, so you don't even, if you didn't see the trailers for the movie, like if it's one of those things where you weren't cognizant, it flew under your radar when it was being promoted, when it was out in the theaters, when it was first debuting, and then you catch it like several years later on cable, you wouldn't know until you watched the credits at the end, Ghost of Elvis, or Elvis played by Val Kilmer. Whereas in the trailer, he was in full it was almost like, where did they even get the shot to use? Like they used unused footage from the movie, and you fully saw that's Val Kilmer dressed like Elvis. Oh my god. So I thought that was interesting, and I always remember being sort of, I don't know, like I guess I was just taken aback by that as a kid, because again, this was at the time where you were just, I think I was just coming into my own in the semiology side of being a fan of films and being able to read certain choices in certain ways and understand why they were done the way they were. And this was one of the first ones where I was kind of like, well, is it because he's doing such a good Elvis impersonation that you don't want to have to fight with the idea of people criticizing the fact that, it's a guy trying to be Elvis? It's funny, in the world of Hollywood, there are times you'll hear stories where, especially now, like I don't know how many people follow the illustrious career of David Arquette, who not only got to play an Elvis impersonator in 3,000 Miles to Graceland, but in Scream, and even now, like when I saw one of his Instagram posts on his birthday, he is a heavily influenced by Elvis kind of guy, and he speaks with a lot of cadences in the same way that Elvis did, and apparently in in one scene in particular in Scream, when you watch that movie, the 1994 Scream, Kevin Williamson, Wes Craven, amazing movie, we'll talk about that at some point, I'm sure. In the commentary, he talks about how his performance in this one scene when he's eating the ice cream and he's the deputy talking to the sheriff, the head of the police department. He's eating an ice cream cone, the sheriff is smoking a cigarette, and he makes sure he is licking the ice cream every time the sheriff is taking a drag off his cigarette. He's also carrying himself, and the way he's looking at the sheriff and the way he's talking, very Elvis-y. And I think maybe as a creative choice for this, to try to avoid that level of being picked apart, where it's like, oh, is it Elvis, or is it a guy trying to be Elvis? The idea that this character that Christian Slater plays really is talking to the ghost of Elvis, kind of perfectly done with this, keeping him in soft focus. But then there are things where, Clarence has a gun that he's planning to bring with him to this one drug deal he's going to, and he puts it on the counter, and Elvis, in full focus, you see his hand picks up the gun, he opens the chamber, he's kind of like weighing it, and at the same time weighing in on some of the ideas that Christian Slater's character is putting forth. I don't know, so I didn't want to make the whole focus of my memory road on this movie being this Elvis thing, but it was something that really stood out. The other thing that stands out, even when you're a kid and don't realize the magnitude of what's going on here, is this face-off scene between Dennis Hopper and Christopher Walken. And it's the only scene Christopher Walken's in. It's the second or third and final scene that Dennis Hopper is in. I mean, the whole movie surrounds this sort of like lone wolf, movie-obsessed guy. So obviously we could see like an analog for Quentin Tarantino there, and he's played by Christian Slater, who works in a comic book store. And he is obsessed with going to like the midnight movie marathons. Goes to see a lot of kung fu movies. And one night he's in the movie theater, and this really hot, but sort of, I don't want to generalize, but she was definitely dressed in a certain way to stereotype someone a little bit out of his league, but definitely someone a little on the tacky side too. Kind of fish out of water, Alabama, who is a character name dropped in Reservoir Dogs. So now you got to start connecting the dots between the Tarantino universe here. And they have this sort of chance meeting at a movie theater. She spills her popcorn all over him, and quickly it's a true romance between the two of them. She winds up coming clean the next day, telling him that she was really a call girl hired by his boss at the comic book store he works at. So another analog for Tarantino working in a video store. Clarence works in a comic book store. And there's a lot of the fan service there too, of like giving you kind of like a perspective on why it's okay to be a comic book nerd, the same way it's okay to be a movie nerd. And that's definitely for people like me. So when I was a teenager watching this movie, it was like, holy shit, somebody who understands us, fucking awesome. And Dennis Hopper is his father, and they quickly get married at City Hall, and then he wants to introduce her to his dad before they blow town, because he winds up finding a suitcase full of what he thought was her clothes, maybe a little bit of money. It turns out to be a suitcase full of uncut cocaine. He gets this from visiting the Gary Oldman Drexel, I think is his name. The Jamaican white Jamaican dreadlock drug dealer who, there's like a whole sort of trope with him in the movie where he thinks he's black, so he's speaking with a cadence. This would be very problematic in the woke world now, I'm sure. Speaking in a lot of street cadences, and so he's the pimp that Patricia Arquette's character was working for. So true to his Elvis-influenced persona, Christian Slater is going to go and extricate her from that life, and some violence ensues. It's pretty awesome. He has sort of like a making his bones moment when he kills Drexel, and he winds up taking a suitcase full of cocaine, which belongs to the mob. So that's how the Christopher Walken character comes in. Winds up getting involved in a few seconds here. But before we get too far away from Gary Oldman, we did see, and also very early in his career, Samuel L. Jackson come in for a moment. This is before we actually see the confrontation between Christian Slater and Gary Oldman. We see Gary Oldman at a drug deal where he winds up taking this cocaine, and Samuel L. Jackson is one of the people in the room that he winds up shooting. But Samuel L. Jackson does actually have a line, as opposed to like his kind of half a line that he had in Goodfellas not too long before this. So yeah, it's chock full of people who will wind up becoming staples in the Tarantino universe going forward. But yeah, so by happenstance, accidents, inexperience, Christian Slater leaves his driver's license behind. He makes sure to grab the suitcase because he thinks it's got Alabama's clothes in it, but he leaves his driver's license behind. So when the mob goes and assesses the damage after Drexel is killed, they have his driver's license. They wind up tracking him. Of course, they miss him by like a half a day, right? Like Christian Slater and Clarence and Alabama stop by at Dennis Hopper's place. They bounce because they're heading out to California because they figure that's where their friend who works in the movie business might be able to help them unload the cocaine. And of course, the mob tracks them to Dennis Hopper's house. And the scene between, this is an epic scene. Everybody, you're sort of in circles of film aficionados and even just kind of more surface level film fans. Anyone older than 35, I would say. When you mention true romance, probably most of the time guys too, the first thing they'll say is, oh man, the Christopher Walken Dennis Hopper scene, the late great Dennis Hopper. has never been, I think, someone quite as scary as the way Christopher Walken can be both charming and menacing at the same time. And so even as a young kid, just kind of dabbling in creative writing, just sort of like, and we didn't see a lot of movies that had these kind of dialogue heavy, totally on a tangent kind of sequences where a lot happens and a lot is being said in the subtext, but even the surface dialogue is kind of captivating. And it's sort of this cat and mouse, the mafia wants to know where his son went, and Dennis Hopper is doing his best to protect his son, so he winds up not only trying to convince them that he doesn't know where they're going, but then when he realizes he's not going to get out of the situation, he goes full bore into what we would later learn to be a Tarantino-esque rant. But this whole story about a show he saw on the History Channel about the history of Sicilian people, knowing that he was going to piss off this mafia guy to the point where they would just kill him and he would, sort of get away with not having to give the information. It's phenomenal. I'm not going to do the dialogue. I'm not going to tell you too much more about it. If you're listening to this and you've never actually seen this movie, I think at this point, I don't even know what else you need to hear from me to be intrigued, at the very least, to go and watch it. But for me, you could tell the impression it's left that I could just sit down and give you like a over 15-minute rant on it right now. And it's so, I don't know, man, I might have to extend this to 20 minutes because you get down the road on this thing and you realize there's so much we didn't even talk about yet. Didn't mention the prominence of Aerosmith, both in the trailer and in a scene in the movie that the trailer sort of teed up. So there was a kind of time in the 90s where, bands and certain singles being featured in the trailer was supposed to help sell the movie, and then I guess sell the soundtrack afterwards. And the music from this movie has been hijacked and featured in commercials and other movies, much like the music from, no one seems to remember it's from Broken Arrow, but it starts to appear in all kinds of other Miramax movies as well. And I think it was Marco Beltrami's music, or it might have been Graham Revell. I don't know. I should know stuff like that before I say it on the podcast. But then if I didn't make mistakes, you people would have no reason to write in and let me know some of your memories about some of these movies. But in any case, True Romance is a movie that is kind of, in some ways sacred. I was watching Back to School the other day, and the late, great Sam Kinison is talking about how he holds history sacred the way a farmer holds the earth in his ground, and he holds it sacred the way a Christian holds the Bible, and he holds it sacred. Well, for me, and for people of my ilk who are film fans through and through, who are probably pretty disappointed with the way the sort of state of Hollywood today, especially as I'm recording this, it's day, 120 plus of the strikes of two major unions, the writer's strike and the WGA and the DGA, both striking. Basically, Hollywood is ground to a halt, and it doesn't show any signs of stopping, and it sort of looks like this might be literally the end of the movie industry as we know it, which I can't even imagine. Maybe that's a little hyperbolic, but it's definitely never going to be the same, that's for sure. And we can thank streaming services for this, apparently. But so that said, the golden era does seem to be the mid 80s through the late 90s, early 2000s. Somewhere in the early 2000s, prior to 2010, I would say, things started to show that they were coming apart at the seams. A lot of the cracks in the paint were starting to become more apparent than not. And certainly once we get into the 20-teens pandemic era and now, it's a total shit show. We're running out of stars. A lot of the major talents have passed away. I mean, how many late greats did I just mention in this? And to think that even after this movie, there are so many others that all these folks still appeared in that we'll be chatting about, I'm sure. But it's kind of an interesting time. We'll see what comes out of it. We may be hitting the final mixing of everything into just gray muck of AI-produced, animated, computer animated, no soul. We'll see. But maybe that'll also be the door opening for a lot of folks who are able to bring a renewed originality to this, like the next Tarantino may surface, and then sort of the next bevy of actual stars. Because a lot of the actors working now, you could never do a movie like True Romance again. There just aren't enough folks. I mean, even Brad Pitt was sort of at the very beginning of his prominence in this, and he's in like 2 scenes, and he's just like a total pothead on the couch smoking a Honey Bear bong, like a bong made out of one of those Honey Bear plastic bottles. He's pretty funny, and it's kind of like, there aren't a lot of filmmakers who do that well. Michael Mann, who I was talking about last time with Heat, he's someone who can have like a Jason Statham pop up for one scene for 2 minutes with one line of dialogue in Collateral, or a Tom Noonan showing up in Heat for one scene with a few lines of dialogue, and yet he's still a prominent character, but you only see him that once and that's it. And it's like the kind of thing where you're watching these movies, and in the opening credits you're seeing all these names on the screen, and you're like, holy shit. Kind of the same way if depending on when you watch it, if you watch everything in the right order, you do expect to see some of these. But if you ever watch Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me and you don't know what you're getting into, and then you see like Heather Graham's name come up on the screen, and then she's only in it for like one scene, has 2 lines of dialogue, and that's it, you never see her again. So David Lynch is another person who does this well. The fact is, though, these actors all need that gravitas and that sort of screen appeal, that recognizability, and the little bit of body of work around them. It's interesting thinking about how far all of these actors went after this movie, but they were all still really big when this happened. I mean, we didn't even talk about Tom Sizemore and Chris Penn as the cop partners who bust Bronson Pinchot, he's the guy connecting Christian Slater to the filmmaker. Oh my God, I forget his name in the movie. This is bad. It's so memorable. I can't remember the character's name, but he's the guy they're going to sell the cocaine to. It's a wild film. Check it out. And you'll see, it'll leave an impression on you too, and maybe 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when you're trying to think of movies that have stayed with you, this one will pop up in mind. But until then, I've been Dave the Klone. It's been way more than 15 minutes. I hope you enjoyed your coffee, and we'll be back on the next installment where we're talking about more movies that have all kinds of memories attached to them for all sorts of reasons. Thank you for checking in. Looking forward to chatting with you again. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Hollow 9 Network, bringing you the very best in fan-made media. That's the word hollow, the number 9, I-N-E. Find the Hollow 9 Network on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat. Rate and review us on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you find your podcasts. Email us at hollow9podcast@gmail.com. Leave us your feedback. Join in the conversation and be a part of the action. Join in the fun. Hollow 9.